We're now going to move to the panel part of our discussion, but to set the landscape for this with an overview of the latest trends in energy markets, I wanted to ask Christoph Ruhl, the chief economist of BP, to come forward and speak for a few minutes. As many of you know, he's one of the world's most influential voices when it comes to studying energy markets, helping the public understand where we've been and where we're going when it comes to the energy world. The statistical review and the energy outlook are some of the most highly anticipated and closely studied products in the energy space. So we're delighted that, Christoph, you could be with us here today. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much for that. Thank you for the invitation. And let me just start first by congratulating you and every single person involved for setting up that center. I've been working on energy economics in my case now for a few years, and I genuinely am still searching for any other subpart of economics where the gap between the importance of a sector and what we actually know about it, and more importantly, what the public knows about it, is that large. And energy is still true that many people can say almost anything when you read the newspapers. And when you were sitting in your White House position and got frustrated because you couldn't get the right information, that's just one indicator of how low the low-hanging fruits are in this area. So I'm very glad that you do this undertaking. And I could not imagine someone, and I mean this seriously, better with your background, your capabilities, and with your ambition to get this off the ground. So that is a good occasion, and thanks for having me here. I was, unfortunately the slides work. I thought I could be quicker without them. I was asked to give a broad overview. We have heard already about global energy markets, and I think we are all energy aficionados here, so I will skip very quickly over the big global picture to focus on one particular aspect which I think is of great interest currently. That is the implications of the so-called shale gas revolution in the US, the strategic, the political, and the energy market, the economic and the energy market implications, but in a broad sense so that we have some meat for discussion. So with that, let me just zoom in a first part through the general energy world, and knowing myself, I'm going to do this without slides, otherwise it takes half an hour, and then spend some time briefly to give you a production profile of how we see the future of shale resources developing, just so that we have some good starting point, and then point out some of these strategic implications which may be worth discussing. The global energy outlook, ours, not very different from what Minister Fallon just told you. We see growth, of course, in a growing world of about 36% between last year and 2030. People always pale when you tell them that, but if you look in the rearview mirror, the system actually grew much faster the last 20 years than everybody is predicting for the next 20 years. So we say 1.6% growth until 2030. The last 20 years have seen 2.1% growth. So it's not impossible to believe that this will happen. It's going to be, as has been pointed out, an energy world which to 80% will still be based on fossil fuels. Very few serious people would deny that. And it's going to be a world which largely is driven by energy demand in the so-called developing part of this world, the industrializing countries of the non-OECD. A footnote here, much less well known, and often you hear people ranting on about energy shortages among the privileged few, typically in the OECD, caused by that energy demand from the developing world. These guys are actually producing as much energy as they have been using over the last few years. The last 10 years, I'm just diving out from the depths of doing the statistical review numbers of last year. So in the last 10 years, contribution of non-OECD to global energy consumption, 99%. Contribution of the non-OECD to global energy production, 98%. So they do their part in that sense. It's going to be a world which is based on changing fuel shales. We all know it's a system which moves very slowly, but it does move. Most notably about them is the decline in the share of oil, which started as a true structural break, starting with the first oil price shock in 1973. We see that continuing. Next year, this year actually, should be the 40th anniversary of oil losing market share year after year. And if things are halfway in line with the picture we are painting there, that will be a world by 2030 where we actually see the shares of the major fossil fuels converging at about 25 to 27% each, for very different reasons, and we don't have the time to go into that now. And that's the real starting point for the following remarks, this is of course also a world where we just come out of 10 years of high and rising prices. You take the average oil price over the last 5 years and compare it with the average oil price for a 5-year period 10 years ago, gone up by 240%. Coal, 130%. Natural gas globally, more than 90%. So 10 years of high and rising prices. And of course, we would expect, even as non-economists, that to trigger some changes in the system. And we see these changes broadly speaking, on the demand side in much improved energy efficiency all over the place. One of the few reliable things which again and again fall out of the data is when prices are high, energy efficiency improves in the long term, full stop, whether we like that or not. And we see it on the supply side. And that's what I want to talk about. On the supply side, we have seen supply reactions, in our view, reactions to high prices, which are captured in the topic of new technologies in the so-called shale revolution. Just to give you an impression, in our book, for all the necessary increases in energy production until to 2030, about 20% of that increment which is necessary will come from new sources in the form of shale gas and shale oil. Another 17%, if you wanted to, you could include that, will come in the form of renewable energy, also a new source. So almost 40% from new stuff, and the 60% from more of the same, more hydro, more nuclear, more coal. With that, let me spend 5 minutes or so outlining to you some of what we think important characteristics of these new unconventional fuels, in particular tight oil, are, before coming to the conclusion, to the possible implications. First of all, that stuff is almost everywhere. Very different from the conventional oil fields we are used to. What you have on the left-hand side here is an assessment, one of the latest available from the IEA, about the technically recoverable resources, not reserves yet. And you can see on the left-hand side it is fairly widely spread, in particular if you take account of the fact that exploration is still in its infancy in many areas, including what we know about the Middle East. On the right-hand side, you see our production estimate as opposed to resource availability to 2030. And you see that us, and we are no exception here, almost any analyst predicts that, you see North America sticking out like a sore thumb. People do expect production of these new resources, of shale resources, still to remain concentrated in North America for a considerable period of time. And that brings me to our production profiles. And before I go into that, brings me to a much, much broader question. We, like others, predict that these resources will have a considerable impact on the future of energy production. And I'm going to detail to you how considerable in a second. But don't take my word for it, because in fact, of course, they are already big. When you look at the US on average imported about 12 million barrels of oil per day in the period 2004 to 2007. By the end of this year, these imports will have fallen by half. If you step back and you ask yourself, where did in the last 5 years the net increase in global oil production come from? It didn't come from OPEC countries. It didn't even come from the Middle East. It came from 2 countries in particular, the US and Canada. And it was all unconventional fuels. And a very good starting point for any discussion of these widely spread unconventional fuel resources would be the question, why is it that of all the countries in the world, it is the US and Canada which generated this so-called shale revolution? And the intuitive answer to that question probably would be, well, must be because that's where the resources are. We all know there's oil sands in Canada and shale resources in the US. But that answer, I think, is almost certainly wrong. Because we also know that there are more oil sands in Venezuela than all of Canada. And nothing, but literally nothing, came out of Venezuela in response to these 10 years of high and rising prices. Most geologists would agree today that China has at least as many shale resources as the US, and nothing came out of China in response to 10 years of rising prices. And you could do the same game with deep water production by comparing Mexico offshore with next door the US offshore. The reason this happened in the US and Canada was most of all that these are open systems with free access and capable of generating competition this way. Everybody can invest in the US or Canada, and everybody does. And the history of that shale gas and now tight oil revolution is one of competition, breeding the new technologies which made it possible to create these resources. It's an almost Schumpeterian process with a lot of small and medium-sized firms moving in first, many of them losing their shirt in this competition, and the big ones only coming after these technologies had been invented. I come back to that point in a second. Now let's focus more narrowly on what the characteristics are. What you have here is a production profile as we have compiled it to the best of our knowledge, taking into consideration geology, what we know about geology anyway, the enormous infrastructure requirements necessary for that stuff, and also what we think about political developments. On the left-hand side, you have the global oil market. We think that by 2030, global oil consumption and production will be somewhere around 104 million barrels per day, not so different from what other people are thinking. And you see how that looks like. The dark area at the bottom, this is conventional non-OPEC oil production, gently declining. The North Sea, Alaska, the Cantarell field in Mexico, resources like that. On top, that is OPEC production. Crude oil, light green, and NGLs, yellow. We see also that going up a little bit over time. And the fan, which is in the middle, these are the unconventional resources we're talking about. Oil sands from Canada, a little bit of biofuels, and then the biggest part of the fan, this is tight oil. The right-hand side shows you the production profile as we see it developing for tight oil. What we have here is a profile which has, before I start about the characters, let me put it in perspective. This is a resource which, as you know, hasn't been around only a few years ago, so we start at virtually zero. We are now, roughly speaking, at about 2% of global oil production already coming from tight oil after a very short period of time. We think it will continue to grow until it, by 2030, covers about 9% of global oil production, about 9 million barrels per day. Considerable order of magnitude. This production profile has three important characteristics. Number one, it continues for this 15 to 20 year period we're looking at to be driven mostly by developments in North America. North America will account for the bulk of production in the foreseeable future. Number two, and based on the production profile of North America, what we're seeing is a period of very, very rapid accelerating growth. We're in the middle of that, and then continued growth, but at a decelerating rate. So growth slowing down after about 2020. Number three, there is, of course, a number of other countries in here which are expected to also develop this resource. The biggest one is Russia, which has tremendous tight oil resources. In this case here, estimated to produce about 1.5 million barrels per day. But the speed at which these countries come in and assume production is not enough to change the fundamental shape of this profile, which has accelerating growth and then slowing growth from 2020 to 2030. We have also, when you saw publicly available, a very similar profile like this for shale gas, which has the advantage that we're further down the road and can make statements with a bit more accuracy. It doesn't look all that differently, but I want you to keep in mind these characteristics. The bulk of it driven by North America, the production profile growing very rapidly until about 2020 and then decelerating. New countries coming in, but not quite fast enough to reverse that deceleration process. Now what do? You do something like this to your best knowledge, and you have no idea how close to reality it really is, because we are at the very beginning of the process. So what we did, truth in advertising, is we took our forecast and compared it with everybody else's forecast. Turns out, cut a long story short, that we are at the very conservative end of the spectrum. Very hard to find people who are more pessimistic than us, and that's another thing I want you to keep in mind, which now makes us ready, I think, to talk about the implications. If we take this very conservative production forecast, there's a number of strategic implications we can outline, and I try to be very, very quick. Number one, especially if you're in my shoes working for a commercial oil company, is of course the question, what will this stuff do to prices? And the answer, if the oil market would be a normal market, would be it brings prices down. The oil market is no normal market because we have OPEC in there. And so in the case of oil markets, this question for the price impact translates pretty seamlessly into the question of how is OPEC going to react to this. Your guess is as good as mine, but ours is that with this order of magnitude, which I've just outlined to you, OPEC will be willing and able to cut production. Right? What does that mean? It means that the demand for OPEC oil goes down until about the end of this decade, and that in response to these cuts, OPEC would generate spare capacity roughly at a level of 6 million barrels per day. That's the highest level of spare capacity since the 1980s. And they will have to work for their money. They will have to maintain it for a number of years. This is not like the crisis in 2009 where you have short periods, short spikes of spare capacity. Now imagine this is a world where most of that spare capacity will have to be carried by Saudi Arabia. It's also a world where you have the US and Russia and Saudi Arabia being able to produce about 10 million barrels per day each. And there you have Saudi Arabia sitting between Iraq on the one side where production is growing, and Iraq is an OPEC member but has no quota, and Iran on the other side where we don't know what will happen over the next 5, 6, 7 years, but where production also may resume growth. So this is a large uncertainty. First impact, it will put pressure on the configuration of oil markets as we know them, on prices, and will put pressure, concretely speaking, on OPEC. Just referring myself to oil. The second one, we do this again faster without slides. The second implication is the enormous importance of policy and politics in this. I've told you already how widespread the resources is. What will narrow the range of uncertainty I've pointed out, this huge range of uncertainty in forecasts? Answer, it will be what our industry calls above ground decisions. It will all be about how fast do you provide access and what kind of restrictions for environmental or other reasons are you putting in place. We're already seeing this. In the US, we have production concentrated in the middle of the country, Dakota, Pennsylvania. We have fields on both coasts in upstate New York and California, which are not accessed because of concerns about fracking. In Europe, you have the Ukraine and Poland begging for more investment. You have France putting a moratorium in place outlawing fracking. And the UK, as you heard it, sort of in the middle, just like other countries in Europe. In China, you have a government decree to local companies to produce it. Didn't work very well so far. In Russia, you have huge known resources and a government still thinking about where to go, where not to go. I don't want to speak of a primacy of policies, but there's an enormously large role for politics and policy in here in determining how fast these countries come online compared to resource availability. Very different from the picture we are used to. Number 3 is the implication which is probably most talked about. It refers to what is often grandly called the geopolitics of energy, and it really means the Middle East. We all grew up in this world where oil was the central fuel and the Middle East was the central providing region. And I'm not making a political statement when I say we all grew up with a thought in the back of our minds that if push comes to shove, the largest consumer on the planet would do what is necessary to restore a certain degree of order, for better or worse. It's just, I think, that we have that, all of us, in the back of our mind is, I think, a fact of life. It's going to be, as we all know, a world in which the US will dramatically need less oil imports, in which China will increase its import requirements greatly. The European Union will maintain to require high imports. And that's a world where I can, at least, the way I always put it, imagine a situation easily where in only 7-8 years from now a Mr. or Mrs. American president looks at some very unpleasant developments in this very central region and says, no skin off my nose. I only need very little oil, and I can get it from Canada or Mexico. I'm not saying this will happen, but I'm saying there's a huge amount of uncertainty around these geopolitics of energy, so-called. I speed up even more. Fourth impact is on the economy. Currently, this is mostly discussed in terms of the advantage the US gets by cheaper feedstock and cheaper electricity prices versus Europe. The reality is that this impact is going to be much more massive. It's going to have a global economic impact. If you ask any economist over the last 10 years or so, before the crisis, during the crisis, and after, what's the biggest macroeconomic problem on the planet? Chances are he or she would have said, it's these global imbalances. the huge trade deficit in the US, the huge trade surplus in China, in Europe to some extent in the Middle East, and the question how they ever rebalance without major shakeup. What I didn't know before we did these numbers is that even today, with falling energy imports in the US, energy still accounts for fully 58% of the US deficit of goods and services. That, everything else equal, will go away. At the same time, these very much rising Chinese energy imports means that energy costs will cut into their trade surplus. The same for Europe, and if prices really come under pressure, the same for the surplus in the Middle East. This doesn't need to happen, of course. The US could decide to import more bicycles or exchange rate movements come in the way. But what I want to point out is that the impact of this is large enough for big multinational institutions to put task force in place to try to sort it out and calculate it. It's going to have a global impact, hopefully a positive one. And finally, there's also a decision point in here, has been alluded to already, for environmentalists. What's it going to be? Fear of fracking or more use of shale gas to replace coal? We have in our outlook now declining carbon emissions in the US. Not because of some complicated energy policy, but because of, among other things, the pretty massive replacement of coal with gas in power generation, bringing down carbon emissions drastically. And this is going to be a debate which already it's part of this political decision-making of where you allow for that stuff to be produced and where not. I have my own suspicions on it because fracking is a local problem and CO2 emissions are a global problem, and these things always end in the same way. But it's another sort of valid case. I stop here, but these are the five main points which I see, which I think are worth debating. What's it going to do to prices and the structure of energy markets? It will put pressure on this configuration of markets as we know it. What is going to be the role of politics in that is going to be hugely bigger than what we have seen in the past. What is the impact on the geopolitics, in particular not of energy, but of the Middle East, creating big uncertainty in that department? What's the global economic impact? Hopefully positive, but certainly with winners and with losers. And what's it going to be in terms of, for those of us interested in environment, which should be most of us, in terms of pushing for these technologies or rejecting them on local grounds? Thank you.
Thanks so much.